It is dawn on the island of Iwo Jima, February 1945. The air is thick with sulfur and smoke, a choking haze that blurs the line between sky and ground. In the black volcanic sand, American Marines crouch behind shattered rock, their helmets glistening with sweat and ash. Ahead of them, the jungle, or what's left of it, whispers with hidden life. Somewhere in that darkness, Japanese soldiers wait, unseen but listening. Hours earlier, they had mocked the strange American weapon, the Flamethrower, a clumsy tank strapped to a man's back, hoses snaking like veins of desperation. They laughed when they saw it sputter during landing drills. When it coughed before roaring, they called it the coward's weapon, something unfit for the warrior spirit of the emperor. But now the air hums differently, a dull metallic click, a hiss, and then a roar that swallows sound itself. Fire arcs forward, liquid and alive, spilling across the earth like molten light. The laughter stops, the jungle turns to fire, and within minutes, the battlefield of Iwo Jima is transformed into a living inferno. The story of how this weapon came to define the Pacific. War begins years earlier in jungles that seemed impossible to conquer. The Pacific War began not with fire, but with surprise. On December 7, 1941, Japan's strike on Pearl Harbor ignited a chain of conflicts stretching from the coral atolls of Micronesia to the dense jungles of New Guinea. The Imperial Japanese Army advanced rapidly across the Pacific, claiming territories with a mix of speed, discipline, and ruthless precision. When American forces first met Japanese troops on land at Guadalcanal in August 1942, they discovered something different from any European battlefield. The jungles were alive, oppressive, and deceptive. Every tree concealed an enemy. Every shadow was a trap. The Japanese had mastered the art of defense through invisibility. Tunnels dug deep into volcanic rock, bunkers covered with palm fronds, and sniper nests hidden in trees. Early American assaults met walls of silence until those walls erupted with machine gun fire. Rifle grenades and mortars disappeared into camouflage so perfect it seemed to breathe. The Marines quickly learned that the enemy did not retreat when surrounded. They vanished underground, only to emerge behind American lines through spider holes and hidden tunnels. Traditional weapons, rifles, grenades, and artillery were often useless. Bombardments leveled the surface, but beneath, the enemy waited unharmed. It became clear that to win in the Pacific, America needed something that could reach into darkness, into tunnels, caves, and bunkers that refused to die. By 1942, the U.S. military had begun examining older, nearly forgotten technology, the flamethrower. The idea dated back to World War I, when German soldiers had used Flammenwerfers to flush Allied troops from trenches. Brutal and feared, the weapon was largely abandoned after 1918 due to its limited range, heavy weight, and the vulnerability of the operator. But the Pacific changed everything. The United States resurrected the concept, refining it for jungle warfare. The first American model, the M1, appeared in 1942. It was primitive, a heavy backpack with twin fuel tanks connected to a small handheld nozzle. It could fire a stream of gasoline about 20 yards, effective at close range, but dangerously short for the Pacific's hidden fortresses. At first, many in the ranks doubted it. The flamethrower seemed cumbersome and risky. Its operators were prime targets, carrying tanks of fuel on their backs that could explode if hit. Japanese defenders laughed when they first saw them in use, often shouting taunts as the early models sputtered or failed to ignite under humidity and rain. But necessity breeds adaptation. American engineers and Marines in the field began modifying the weapon, experimenting with pressurization systems and fuel mixtures. They added thicker gasoline, creating a sticky, burning gel that clung to surfaces, a precursor to napalm. The result was horrifyingly effective. By the time of the 1943 Tarawa invasion, the improved M2 model could project flames over 40 yards, with bursts lasting up to 10 seconds. It was enough to clear a bunker or a tunnel entrance in seconds. Still, the weapon required a special kind of courage. Flamethrower operators were often isolated, moving ahead of infantry under covering fire. They knew they were targets. Japanese snipers would focus on them first, recognizing the silhouette of the twin tanks. Many operators didn't survive their first mission, yet their weapon began turning the tide in the Pacific. At Tarawa, Marines learned that fire could do what bullets could not. It could reach into the enemy's hiding places, sucking oxygen out of sealed bunkers, forcing defenders to flee or perish in suffocating heat. Reports described scenes of unbearable intensity, bunkers exploding into fireballs, tunnels filled with smoke and screams. The Japanese, once dismissive, began to fear the weapon. It became a symbol of American persistence, crude, relentless, and impossible to stop. By late 1943, U.S. commanders realized that the flamethrower was not just a weapon of destruction, it was a psychological one. It broke morale as effectively as it burned through steel. Entire Japanese positions surrendered rather than face it. But this transformation, from improvised tool to fearsome instrument of war, didn't happen overnight. Behind every burst of fire was a chain of invention, logistics, and brutal field testing. As 1944 dawned, the United States prepared for its greatest challenges: Saipan, Peleliu, and eventually Iwo Jima. The jungles were turning into fortresses, and America was about to bring a new kind of firepower to bear. By 1944, the Pacific Campaign had transformed from small island clashes into vast coordinated operations. The U.S. Navy ruled the sea, and the Army air forces dominated the sky. But on land, victory still had to be earned bunker by bunker. Every island Japan fortified became a maze of tunnels, pillboxes, and caves, and in that maze the flamethrower found its dreadful purpose. The weapon evolved quickly. Engineers at the U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service and the Marine Corps sought lighter, more reliable systems. The M22 model became the standard issue, compact, better balanced, and fitted with improved ignition systems that could operate even in tropical humidity. It fired with compressed nitrogen, forcing a thickened fuel mixture through its nozzle, creating a burning jet that could reach up to 50 yards. Then came the greatest innovation, the pairing of the flamethrower with armor. By late 1944, the Marine Corps introduced the M4A3R3 Zippo, a Sherman tank modified with twin flame projectors mounted in its bow. The concept was simple but devastating. Deliver the destructive power of the flamethrower while protecting its operator behind armor. The Zippos could carry over 250 gallons of napalm-thickened fuel and project it more than 150 yards. Entire cave systems were neutralized in minutes. These armored flamethrowers would later define assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but their origins lay in desperate improvisation. On Saipan, for example, mechanics rigged field modifications by attaching portable flamethrower units to tanks using steel tubing and spare pumps. The results were crude but so effective that formal production soon followed. For American commanders, the weapon solved one of the war's most haunting problems: how to dislodge an enemy that refused to surrender. Japanese soldiers saw surrender as dishonor, preferring to die in battle or suicide. They built labyrinths beneath the earth, connecting command posts, living quarters, and artillery positions through miles of tunnels. Ordinary grenades could not reach them. Artillery often collapsed entrances but left interiors untouched. Fire, however, consumed air itself. When a flamethrower blast entered a cave, it burned oxygen and created a vacuum effect, suffocating defenders in seconds. Marines called it cooking a cave. Horrifyingly efficient, it left no room for negotiation. By 1944, tactical manuals began incorporating flamethrowers into standard assault procedures. Platoons were assigned 1 or 2 operators, often working in tandem with demolition men. The coordination was precise. Riflemen provided covering fire while the flamethrower advanced, purging enemy positions one by one. In the field, every drop of fuel was precious. Operators often carried only 2 minutes of burn time total. A single misfire or jam could mean death. Training emphasized calmness under pressure, controlling bursts, conserving fuel, and aiming low to let flames crawl into openings before sweeping upward. The Japanese response varied between disbelief and terror. Early in the war, they mocked the weapon's bulk and limited range. By 1944, intelligence reports described panic spreading through defensive units when they heard the distinct hiss of a flamethrower being armed. Some fled their positions. Others detonated grenades rather than burn alive. Still, the weapon's use came at a psychological cost to those who wielded it. Marines later spoke of nightmares and guilt, the sight of flame entering bunkers, the sound of screams muffled by earth. It was, as one veteran wrote, a weapon that turned men into ghosts long before they died. Yet in military terms, its impact was undeniable. On Peleliu, where Japanese forces fought from coral ridges honeycombed with caves, the flamethrower cleared positions that artillery had bombarded for days without effect. On Saipan, it destroyed 70% of all known bunker systems. Commanders took note. The U.S. Army and Marine Corps began to integrate flame units into their assault doctrine for the upcoming battles of 1945. Engineers at the Chemical Warfare Service refined fuel formulas, thickening gasoline with napalm powder to extend burn duration and increase adhesion. The once crude tool was now a precision weapon of siege warfare, both feared and indispensable. As the Pacific Campaign pressed toward Japan's inner islands, the landscape changed from open coral beaches to volcanic rock and dense jungle. The final battles, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, would test every weapon America had developed. In those crucibles, the flamethrower would reach its terrible maturity. The next chapter of the story unfolds not in laboratories or planning rooms, but on the front lines, through the eyes of those who carried the tanks, faced the heat, and changed the course of the Pacific War one bunker at a time. The human angle. The man behind the fire. Every weapon has a sound. The rifle cracks, the mortar thumps, and the tank rumbles, but the flamethrower hisses, a long, trembling sound that lives between life and death. For the man who carried it, that sound became part of his heartbeat. Flamethrower operators were volunteers, or, more often, chosen men with calm nerves and compact frames. The tank and fuel lines weighed nearly 70 pounds when full. In the heat of the Pacific, that was like wearing another man on your back. They moved low and deliberate. Riflemen provided cover, knowing the operator drew enemy fire like a magnet. A single hit could rupture the tank. A stray bullet could ignite it. Survival meant precision and nerves of steel. Many of these men were in their late teens or early 20s. Some had never seen combat before, strapping on the weapon that made them both predator and target. Marine CPL Herschel Woody Williams was one of them. At Iwo Jima, he crawled forward under heavy machine gun fire, igniting pillbox after pillbox with an M2 flamethrower. His actions, lasting nearly 4 hours, earned him the Medal of Honor and haunted him for decades. In interviews years later, Williams spoke with quiet honesty. He said he never saw the Japanese as monsters, but as men doing what they believed was their duty. He described his weapon as a terrible thing, but necessary. His words echoed the weight carried by thousands of others. For every successful burst of fire, there was a personal cost, a flash that burned itself not only into the earth but also into memory. 2. The tactical angle. The fire team's spearhead. The flamethrower was not a lone weapon. It was part of a choreography designed for destruction. A standard Marine assault unit in 1944 consisted of riflemen, grenadiers, and a two-man flamethrower team. One man carried the weapon. The other supplied fuel and protection. Their role was to lead the approach toward enemy fortifications once suppressing fire pinned defenders down. Tactically, it was terrifyingly effective. A bunker might have withstood hundreds of rounds of ammunition, but one burst of flame into the firing slit changed everything. The fire rolled inward, igniting ammunition, consuming air, and forcing occupants to flee, often right into the waiting rifles of advancing Marines. On Peleliu, company commanders began to assign flamethrowers in pairs to cover each other's advance. When the first man exhausted his tanks, the second moved up. Coordination with demolition men carrying satchel charges turned the process into a grim rhythm. Flame, explosion, advance. The Japanese defensive doctrine relied on concealment and endurance. They built interlocking tunnel systems designed to absorb bombardment, but flamethrowers introduced an element of unpredictability. The Japanese could not know when the next jet of fire would pierce the darkness of their shelter. In many cases, positions were abandoned before they were ever directly attacked. The weapon also changed the tempo of assault warfare. Traditional infantry tactics relied on grenades and small arms fire to neutralize strongpoints. Those methods were slow and costly. Fire, by contrast, spread instantly, clearing not just one bunker but entire connecting networks. Still, using the weapon required control. Too early and the fire warned the next position. Too late and it risked hitting friendly troops. Flamethrower operators were trained to fire short bursts, just enough to flush the enemy, then retreat before counterfire found them. Marines learned to trust the hiss. When it came, they knew the fight was turning in their favor. 3. The technological angle. Building the weapon that shouldn't work. From a design standpoint, the flamethrower was an engineering contradiction. Heavy but portable, simple but deadly. The M2 model featured 2 cylindrical tanks for fuel, 1 smaller tank for pressurizing gas, and a handheld wand called the projector. When the operator squeezed the trigger, nitrogen forced fuel through the hose. At the nozzle's end, a small ignition system, originally a pilot light, later a battery-powered spark, turned the stream into fire. But what truly changed the weapon's nature was fuel chemistry. Early models used standard gasoline. The flames burned hot but were short-lived and splashed harmlessly off surfaces. Engineers at Harvard University and the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service began experimenting with aluminum soap-thickening agents in 1943. The result was a sticky, semi-liquid gel that adhered to walls, uniforms, and steel. This was napalm. Napalm extended the flame's reach and persistence. It burned longer, hotter, and more unpredictably, clinging to whatever it touched. The Pacific climate only amplified its brutality. In humid air, the fire seemed to crawl rather than flicker, spreading across bunker entrances and down tunnel mouths. Technicians also improved ignition reliability. Earlier spark systems often failed in wet or windy condi. The enemy's angle, the fire. They never believed to the Japanese soldier. The Pacific War was more than a military campaign. It was a spiritual struggle. The Bushido Code, drawn from centuries of samurai tradition, emphasized honor in death and loyalty to the emperor above life itself. This mindset shaped how Japan built its defenses across the Pacific Islands. At Guadalcanal and Tarawa, defenders learned that no surface position could withstand American bombardment. They adapted by going underground, digging into coral, rock, and volcanic soil to create elaborate bunkers, tunnels, and chambers. Inside these labyrinths, soldiers lived, slept, and fought. They saw themselves as part of the earth, immovable, eternal. When the first flamethrowers appeared, many Japanese soldiers dismissed them as inefficient and clumsy. Their doctrine focused on shock tactics and close-quarters combat. To them, courage lay in the bayonet charge or banzai assault, not in hiding from fire. But the laughter soon faded. Reports recovered from Japanese officers' diaries after the battles of Saipan and Peleliu reveal the transformation. One account from a company commander on Peleliu read, "We could not breathe. The fire came through the holes like wind, and the air became thick and white. Men were burning inside their helmets. The weapon's terror came not only from the flames, but also from the silence before them, the hiss that signaled an instant death without honor. It robbed the defenders of visibility, of control, of the one thing the Japanese army prized most, composure under pressure. By 1944, Japanese soldiers began constructing flame-proof barriers, sand-filled drums, double walls of coral, and even water trenches inside tunnels. Some units stockpiled buckets of sand to smother flames. But in practice, these measures rarely worked. Once ignited, the napalm clung, consuming oxygen faster than it could be replaced. Entire units were found dead, not from burns, but from suffocation. To the Imperial Army, the flamethrower became a symbol of American relentlessness, a weapon that defied their understanding of courage. The jungle that once gave them invisibility had turned against them, lit from within by an enemy they could not see until it was too late. 5. The psychological angle. Fear on both sides sides, war reshapes fear. For the Japanese, the flamethrower became an omen. For the Americans, it was a burden. Psychologists attached to Marine divisions during and after the Pacific Campaign documented a unique emotional pattern among flamethrower operators. Unlike machine gunners or artillerymen, they witnessed the direct effects of their weapon at intimate range. The smell, the screams, the instant transformation of human forms, these memories stayed vivid for decades. In post-war studies, veterans described recurring nightmares of flames that would not stop burning. Many suffered what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress, though the term did not exist then. One Marine wrote in his diary after Iwo Jima, "You do not kill with a flamethrower, you erase." For frontline troops, the psychological effect was paradoxical. The flamethrower offered power, the ability to end a fight instantly, yet it also isolated its user morally. Few men wanted to carry it. Those who did were both respected and avoided. They became symbols of destruction, often fighting alone at the edges of their own units. On the Japanese side, the fear was absolute. Prisoner interrogations after the battles of Tinian and Guam revealed that many soldiers saw the flamethrower as a weapon from hell. One captured officer stated that his men refused to stay in forward positions once they heard its sound. Some committed suicide rather than face it. Commanders on both sides understood this fear. American officers began deploying flamethrowers not only for their tactical use, but also for their psychological value. A few seconds of visible flame was sometimes enough to force surrender. The sound, the light, and the smell carried farther than bullets could. In that strange equation of terror, both sides were consumed, one by fire, the other by what it meant to use it. 6. The moral angle. Fire and the edge of humanity. Even in war, there are lines that soldiers hesitate to cross. The flamethrower stood near that line. It was not technically prohibited under the Hague or Geneva Conventions of the time, but even its users questioned whether it should exist. Unlike a bullet which kills unseen or a shell which destroys from afar, the flamethrower demanded proximity. It forced men to confront the full horror of what they inflicted. Military commanders justified it as a necessity. Bunkers and caves were nearly impregnable. The alternative was sending infantry into tunnels with grenades, a death sentence for both sides. Fire, they argued, was mercy through efficiency. It ended battles quickly. Yet letters home from Pacific veterans told a different story. Many refused to describe their missions in detail. Others confessed shame. "We did what we had to do," one Marine wrote from Okinawa. "But sometimes I wonder what kind of men we became." After the war, public opinion turned sharply against flame weapons. Images of blackened caves and melted steel haunted audiences back home. Scientists who had engineered napalm faced their own moral reckonings. One chemist from the Harvard group later said, "We thought we were saving lives by ending war faster. We never imagined what it would look like." Still, the military logic was undeniable. The flamethrower shortened sieges, reduced casualties among attackers, and saved lives that would otherwise have been lost in prolonged assaults. War, as always, blurred the boundary between morality and survival. For both nations, the weapon became more than a tool. It was a mirror reflecting the extremes of human endurance and ingenuity, and that mirror would shatter completely on Iwo Jima, where men and machines met in the most intense inferno of the Pacific. February 19th, 1945, the island of Iwo Jima emerged from the Pacific like a black scar. Barely 8 square miles of volcanic rock, it stood halfway between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese mainland, a strategic stepping stone for the coming air campaign against Tokyo. But beneath its gray ash and sulfuric ridges lay a fortress. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of Iwo Jima's garrison, had transformed the island into a honeycomb of defense. 11 miles of tunnels connected more than 1,500 rooms, command posts, artillery chambers, barracks, and hospitals. Every ridge concealed guns. Every cave held men prepared to die. When the first wave of 30,000 U.S. Marines landed on the island's southern beaches, there was silence. No gunfire greeted them. No resistance, only wind and sulfur smoke. The men advanced, cautious and uncertain. Then, after 1 full hour, the island erupted. From Mount Suribachi to the northern cliffs, Japanese guns opened in unison. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery tore into the black sand. Marines dropped by the hundreds, unable to dig foxholes in the shifting ground. For days, they fought for every yard, often unable to see the enemy who was killing them. Beneath the surface, Kuribayashi's men held their fire until Americans were within 50 yards of their positions. Then they unleashed waves of destruction before vanishing again into their tunnels. It was warfare by shadows. The traditional weapons of the U.S. infantry were useless against the underground fortress. Grenades disappeared into the dark without effect. Rifle fire did nothing. Even naval bombardments, which flattened the island's surface, failed to touch the deep chambers below. That was when the flamethrower became indispensable. Each Marine division carried several flamethrower sections. On Iwo Jima, they worked without pause. Some advanced on foot, others operated from armored vehicles. When a cave mouth was located, riflemen laid suppressive fire as the operator approached. Then came the hiss, a sound every man on that island would remember forever. In a jet of orange light, the darkness disappeared. The fire swept into the cave, crawling across walls and ceilings, exploding ammunition and suffocating defenders. When it was over, only silence remained. Marines described the process clinically, sealed and cleared. But what those words meant was something far more brutal. Over the next week, Iwo Jima became a battlefield of flame. The M4A3R3 Zippo tanks rolled forward, their flame projectors mounted where machine guns once sat. Each carried nearly 300 gallons of fuel, enough for 20 bursts of 10 seconds each. Their operators called them flame tracks. When the Zippos fired, the effect was apocalyptic. The thick napalm burned at over 1,000 degrees Celsius, clinging to rock, steel, and flesh alike. Flames reached 150 yards into tunnel openings, lighting the interior like daylight. Even the volcanic rock glowed red. Marine war correspondents described the island as burning from within. Photographs taken from reconnaissance planes showed plumes of black smoke rising from hundreds of points, simultaneously as if the earth itself were on fire. In one of the most harrowing examples, on February 23rd, the 21st Marine Regiment used both portable flamethrowers and Zippo tanks to clear a defensive network near Hill 362. The Japanese had fortified it with machine gun nests and mortar pits, all connected underground. After hours of fighting, the Marines closed in. The first flamethrower teams exhausted their fuel and fell back. Then the Zippos advanced. They fired alternately into each entrance, sealing them one by one. When the smoke cleared, the hill was silent. More than 200 defenders were dead inside. The tunnels turned into glowing tombs. CPL Herschel Woody Williams was among those who carried the weapon through the chaos. Over 4 hours, he used 6 separate flamethrowers, each emptied and replaced, to destroy 7 reinforced bunkers under relentless fire. His calm precision, captured in later reports, became legend. Williams received the Medal of Honor for his actions, but his words afterward told a deeper truth. "I always wondered," he said, "how many lives I took and how many I saved." The psychological impact on both sides was immeasurable. Marines began to associate fire with progress. The more caves burned, the more ground they gained. For the Japanese, the sound of the Zippo's ignition signaled death. Soldiers would scream warnings, "Oh no, fire, fire," before entire positions went silent. By the end of February, the island was a furnace. Hills that had names only on maps, Suribachi, Motoyama, Kitano Point, became synonymous with suffering. The air stank of sulfur, smoke, and something far worse, the scent of burned earth and bodies. When the American flag rose on Mount Suribachi, the battle was far from over. Thousands of Japanese soldiers still fought on in the north, deep inside their tunnels. The fighting would last for another month. But something irreversible had happened. Fire had become the language of the battlefield, the one element that could reach the unreachable. And as Iwo Jima burned, the architects of the Pacific War, on both sides, began to grasp what this meant for the next and final stage. Okinawa, glow-in tombs, con CPL Herschel Woody Williams was among those who carried the weapon through the chaos. Over 4 hours, he used 6 separate flamethrowers, each emptied and replaced, to destroy 7 reinforced bunkers under relentless fire. His calm precision, captured in later reports, became legend. Williams received the Medal of Honor for his actions, but his words afterward told a deeper truth. "I always wondered," he said, "how many lives I took and how many I saved." The psychological impact on both sides was immeasurable. Marines began to associate fire with progress. The more caves burned, the more ground they gained. For the Japanese, the sound of the Zippo's ignition signaled death. Soldiers would scream warnings, "Oh no, fire, fire," before entire positions went silent. By the end of February, the island was a furnace. Hills that had names only on maps, Suribachi, Motoyama, Kitano Point, became synonymous with suffering. The air stank of sulfur, smoke, and something far worse, the scent of burned earth and bodies. When the American flag rose on Mount Suribachi, the battle was far from over. Thousands of Japanese soldiers still fought on in the north, deep inside their tunnels. The fighting would last for another month. But something irreversible had happened. Fire had become the language of the battlefield, the one element that could reach the unreachable. And as Iwo Jima burned, the architects of the Pacific War, on both sides, began to grasp what this meant for the next and final stage. Okinawa, April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. Across the swells of the East China Sea, 300 American ships formed the largest amphibious assault fleet of the Pacific War. Ahead of them lay Okinawa, the final stepping stone to Japan itself. 82 days later, it would become the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. Okinawa was not a small island fortress like Iwo Jima. It was vast, 70 miles long, mountainous, and inhabited by nearly 500,000 civilians. The Japanese 32nd Army, under General Mitsuru Ushijima, had dug in deep. Their defenses stretched from the coral ridges of Shuri to the limestone caves of the southern coast. Unlike previous battles, they would not attack at the beaches. Ushijima's plan was to bleed the Americans dry, inch by inch, cave by cave. When U.S. Marines and Army divisions landed, they met little resistance, but as they moved inland, the hills came alive. Machine guns and mortars erupted from unseen holes. Entire platoons vanished into the smoke. The rain turned the soil into mud, clogging rifles and filling foxholes. The only certainty was that the enemy was ever everywhere and nowhere. Within days, the flamethrower once again became the most feared and necessary weapon on the island. Portable M2s accompanied every assault squad, but Okinawa's terrain demanded something more. The tunnels were larger, the cave systems deeper, and the defenders more fanatical. The answer came in the form of armored fire. The M4A3R3 Zippo tanks refined after Iwo Jima. Each Zippo operated in coordination with infantry and engineers. Riflemen would locate cave mouths. Demolition men cleared the approach. Then the Zippo advanced, its short flamethrower barrel mounted in the hull. The tank's crew could unleash a jet of burning napalm that reached farther than any infantry weapon in history. When the first flame tanks fired, witnesses said the hills seemed to exhale fire. The jets burned for 10 full seconds, lighting the sky even in daylight. Flames poured into tunnels, then roared out of vents hundreds of feet away. Entire cave networks ignited like lungs drawing their final breath. The 6th Marine Division, advancing on the northern ridges, reported using more than 600 flamethrower tanks in a single month. At the same time, Army units in the south, the 96th and 7th Infantry Divisions, fought through the Shuri line, where Ushijima's troops fought to the last man. The caves there were fortified with steel doors and internal compartments to trap the flames. It made no difference. When the Zippos fired, the blast overpressure shattered everything inside. Marines began referring to the weapon as the Dragon. Where it moved, resistance vanished. The only thing left behind was black smoke curling from cracks in the hills. But for the men who fought beside it, the victory came with unease. The air was thick with smoke and screams that no one wanted to hear. War correspondents wrote that Okinawa looked as if the earth had caught fire and was refusing to die. The Japanese fought with increasing desperation. Some units attempted suicide charges at night, hoping to destroy the flamethrower tanks with explosives strapped to their bodies. Others sealed themselves inside caves, detonating grenades before the flames reached them. The fire, in a sense, gave them their wish, death by their own will, not capture. Among the civilians trapped in the crossfire, the weapon's impact was devastating. Okinawan villagers, forced by Japanese soldiers to shelter in military tunnels, found themselves caught in the inferno. Many suffocated or burned as the caves ignited. Though the U.S. military tried to minimize civilian casualties, the chaos of battle left little control. The island itself seemed to consume its people. For weeks, rain poured over Okinawa, mixing ash with mud, extinguishing fires only for them to begin again elsewhere. The hills around Shuri Castle glowed red at night, illuminated by thousands of small blazes from napalm and tracer fire. By May, the Japanese 32nd Army was collapsing. General Ushijima, realizing defeat was inevitable, gathered his officers on the southern cliffs. On June 22, 1945, he committed ritual suicide. The battle had lasted nearly 3 months. More than 12,000 Americans were dead. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers perished. Civilian losses exceeded 100,000. In the aftermath, U.S. military analysts reviewed the operation. One statistic stood out. Flamethrowers, both portable and armored, had been used in more than 70% of all Japanese defensive positions neutralized on Okinawa. The weapon had not only broken fortification, it had broken resistance, but Okinawa also marked an ending. The war was entering its final phase. Plans for the invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, called for the largest deployment of flamethrowers in history. Thousands of new Zippo tanks were being prepared. Each was to carry 400 gallons of napalm. On the beaches of Kyushu, they would burn every bunker and cave. That invasion never came. 2 months later, the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. The age of fire was replaced by the age of light, a blinding flash that ended the war but left humanity staring at its own reflection in the glow. Still, for the men who had fought in the jungles and caves, the memory of the flamethrower endured. They had seen what fire could do when unleashed by human hands. One Marine wrote home after Okinawa, his letter simple and raw. "We thought the fire was ours, but it belonged to no one. It burned everything." And so the Pacific Campaign closed not with victory songs, but with silence, the kind that follows when the world itself has been set alight. The island graves and the lessons of fire. When the last guns fell silent on Okinawa, the land was no longer recognizable. Every ridge, cave, and coral outcrop bore the marks of fire and steel. The lush greens that had once covered the island were gone, replaced by scorched earth and twisted trees. The smell of sulfur hung in the air for weeks, seeping into every uniform, every tent, and every breath. For the U.S. forces, Okinawa was both a triumph and a warning. They had won, but at a cost so staggering it shook even the most hardened commanders. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commander of the 10th Army, was among the last to fall, killed by artillery in the final days of the battle. His death symbolized the price of victory. No one, not even a general, was beyond the reach of that inferno. In the ruins of Shuri and along the cliffs of Mabuni, burial details worked without pause. Thousands of dead Japanese were interred in shallow graves or cremated where they fell. Many had died inside their tunnels sealed by explosions or fire. Marines reported finding entire platoons burned into silence, their weapons still grasped in skeletal hands. For every Marine who had once feared those caves, seeing them now filled only with ash brought no joy, only exhaustion. Military photographers documented the aftermath. Their images, later censored for the public, showed showed the reality of fire warfare, caves reduced to black pits, equipment fused to the walls, and faces turned to shadow. The flamethrower, once hailed as a tactical marvel, now appeared as both a weapon and a warning. The American military command began compiling reports. Engineers analyzed every engagement where flamethrowers were used, recording data on range, pressure, and efficiency. Psychologists were also brought in, not to study the enemy, but their own troops. A pattern emerged. Flamethrower operators, though highly decorated, showed higher rates of trauma than most frontline soldiers. The act of burning another human being, even an unseen one in a cave, left deep psychological scars. One Marine corporal interviewed months later admitted, "You told yourself they were the enemy, but you still heard them scream, and you remembered it every night." Despite its horrors, the weapon's effectiveness was undeniable. The Navy Bureau of Ordnance and the Army Corps of Engineers concluded that no other infantry weapon had achieved comparable results against fortified positions. The reports recommended an expansion of flame units for the planned invasion of Japan. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, the Japanese military struggled to understand what had happened. Survivors from Okinawa and earlier island battles described the weapon with a mix of awe and despair. Many believed it stripped the honor from combat, denying a soldier the chance to die fighting. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff reviewed intercepted footage and reports from Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They realized that traditional defenses, caves, bunkers, even steel doors, offered no true protection. In a secret memorandum, one officer wrote, "The Americans have found a way to bring the sun into our tunnels." By mid-1945, Japan's high command had no illusions about what an American invasion would mean. They knew the beaches of Kyushu and Honshu would not only face bombs and artillery, but also fire itself. In a final act of grim preparation, they began constructing deeper shelters for civilians, reinforcing them with concrete. Yet even then, engineers warned that nothing could truly stop the flame. Across the Pacific, at newly established bases on Guam and Saipan, rows of Zippo tanks waited. Marines trained with them daily, practicing coordinated assaults with infantry and demolition teams. The operators, nicknamed Dragon Men, learned to fire, sweep, and retreat with precision, the choreography of destruction. They knew the weapon's every detail: 290 gallons of fuel, 4,000 psi pressure, and a jet that burned at nearly 1,500 degrees. But what none of them could predict was how soon the war would end. In the laboratories of Los Alamos and the skies over Hiroshima, another fire was being prepared, one that would make the flamethrower seem almost primitive. And yet, as the mushroom cloud rose over Japan, the legacy of those island fires remained. The men who had wielded the flamethrower had seen war stripped of distance, reduced to its rawest form, man against man, fire against flesh. Their story did not end when the war did, because the weapon that burned the Pacific would follow them home, in memory, in nightmares, and in the moral questions it left behind. When the ships returned from the Pacific, the men who had fought in those jungles carried more than medals. They carried the memory of what fire could do and what it meant to use it. For many flamethrower operators, the war didn't end when they left Okinawa or Iwo Jima. It lingered in dreams, tunnels glowing, air filled with screams that had no faces. The sound of ignition, that distinct hiss, could bring them back in an instant. Some never spoke of it again. Others tried to explain, only to be met with silence. Herschel Woody Williams, the Medal of Honor recipient from Iwo Jima, later described how the weapon haunted him. "I had nightmares for years," he admitted. "When I closed my eyes, I saw fire. I could smell it." Yet, like so many others, he also believed it had saved countless lives, that without it, the war would have lasted far longer, at a cost even greater. It was a paradox every flamethrower veteran lived with, a weapon of horror that had become a necessity. In post-war America, the military quickly recognized both the power and controversy of the flamethrower. During the Korean War and later in Vietnam, the weapon returned to the battlefield, its design refined, but its nature unchanged. Reporters and human rights groups began questioning its morality. Was such a weapon, one that killed not through bullets or explosions but through living flame, compatible with modern warfare? The United States defended its use under the laws of war, arguing it was a tool, not a torture device, intended for fortifications, not people. Yet on the ground, soldiers knew there was no such separation. When a bunker or a hut caught fire, whoever was inside burned. By the 1970s, the international community began to act. The 1980 United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons sought to restrict the use of incendiary weapons against civilian populations. By then, the flamethrower had largely vanished from U.S. arsenals, replaced by more precise explosives, thermobaric charges, and guided munitions. But the memory of it, that primal terror of man-made fire, remained etched in the psyche of those who had seen it. Historians later described the flamethrower as the most psychologically devastating weapon of World War. For the Japanese soldier who heard its hiss, there was no defense. For the American who carried it, there was no forgetting. One Marine veteran interviewed decades after the war said quietly, "You didn't hate the men in the caves. caves. You hated the caves. The dark, the waiting. The fire took that away. It made it end. But you never felt proud. In Japan, the memory of the flamethrower became part of the nation's collective trauma. Survivors from Saipan, Okinawa, and the Philippines recalled the terror of hiding in tunnels as the walls began to glow. Civilians spoke of praying that the flames would pass quickly, that their deaths would be swift. The weapon, for many, came to symbolize the overwhelming force of American technology and the futility of resistance. Museums in Tokyo and Naha would later display fragments of scorched helmets and melted rifles found in those caves, relics of a war that had burned too brightly to forget. In these quiet exhibits, the flamethrower's legacy isn't one of triumph but of warning. After the war, technology advanced faster than anyone could imagine. Jet engines replaced propellers, missiles replaced artillery, and nuclear power redefined destruction. Yet in the shadow of all those inventions, the flamethrower remained the most intimate form of devastation, a weapon that required a man to walk forward, to face his enemy directly, and to unleash the most ancient of elements. That intimacy is what makes its story endure. It reminds us that even in an age of machines, war is still fought by human hands. Hands that tremble, hands that obey, hands that carry fire. And though the weapon was eventually retired, its spirit never disappeared. The concept of flame, controlled, directed, weaponized, evolved into new technologies. Incendiary grenades, fuel-air explosives, and even the fiery exhausts of napalm bombs dropped over Korea and Vietnam. Each generation found new ways to harness destruction, but the principle remained the same. In the Pacific, the Americans had proven that fire could conquer any fortress. Yet in doing so, they also revealed something deeper, that victory by flame carries a cost no victory parade can erase. As the veterans of those battles aged and faded from public memory, they left behind more than photographs and medals. They left a caution that the fire we wield to destroy can one day consume us if we forget what it means. The jungles of the Pacific never fully recovered. Even now, fragments of melted steel and glass lie buried beneath the soil, silent witnesses to a war fought with every element of nature: earth, water, wind, and above all, fire. And so from those scorched islands, a single truth emerged, one that history still struggles to hold. You can conquer with flame, but you can never control it. In every age of war, men have turned to fire. From the burning of ships in ancient harbors to the bombardment of cities under modern skies, it has always been the same element: pure, uncontrollable, alive. During World War II, that element was given a metal shell, a fuel tank, and a man to carry it. The flamethrower turned one soldier into a walking furnace, and for a brief, terrible moment in history, it gave humanity a glimpse of what it meant to command the sun. But history is not kind to such power. The men who fought in those jungles learned that fire obeys no side. It consumes all: the enemy, the landscape, and often the one who wields it. Their battles were not only for ground, but for control over something far greater: the human capacity for destruction. When the Pacific War ended, the world looked upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki and saw fire's final evolution, no longer in a tank or hose, but in a blinding flash that erased entire cities. In that instant, the flamethrower seemed almost primitive, but its lesson endured. It had shown that victory could be total and yet utterly hollow. Today, few remember the men who carried those steel tanks on their backs, who walked into tunnels that breathed death, who faced enemies they could not see. They fought not for glory, but for survival, and in doing so, they changed the nature of modern warfare. Their weapon burned jungles, bunkers, and islands, but it also burned away the illusion that war could ever be clean. The fire they unleashed still flickers in memory, in the veterans' stories, in the blackened earth of the Pacific, and in the conscience of every nation that learned what such power could do. Because in the end, the flamethrower's legacy is not one of domination, but of warning. It reminds us that progress and peril are born of the same spark, and that every time mankind creates a new flame, whether in war or in science, it must decide once again whether to hold it or let it burn the world.